The year is 1989. We are in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. A fleet of 17 attack submarines breaches the surface. They are flanked by a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer. This is a naval force capable of closing shipping lanes, enforcing blockades, and causing a significant geopolitical headache. But look closer at the flag. It's not the Stars and Stripes. It's not the British Union Jack. And, weirdly enough, it's not exactly the Soviet hammer and sickle either. It's Pepsi? Yes. For a brief, bizarre moment in history, the people who make your second favorite cola possessed the 6th largest naval fleet in the world. They had more submarines than Australia, Sweden, and Canada combined. So, how did a company founded to cure dyspepsia end up commanding a literal armada of Soviet warships? Was there a secret cola war we didn't know about? Was the Pepsi man actually a KGB sleeper agent? To answer that, we have to go back. Before the ships, before the vodka, back to a time when the only thing colder than a glass of soda was the war itself. The year is 1959. The Cold War is in full swing. The USA and the USSR are staring at each other across the globe, fingers hovering over the end civilization button. Everyone is tense. Everyone is paranoid. In an attempt to, not blow up the planet, President Eisenhower and Premier Nikita Khrushchev decided to try something different. Cultural exchange. Hey, they said, instead of showing you our missiles, let's show you our dishwashers. Enter the American National Exhibition in Moscow. It was a massive trade show designed to showcase the superiority of the American way of life. Capitalism, consumerism, shiny appliances. Representing Uncle Sam was Vice President Richard Nixon, and representing the Soviet Union was Nikita Khrushchev, a man who looked like your angry grandfather and had a temper to match. Now, lurking in the shadows of this exhibition was a man named Donald Kendall. Donald was the head of Pepsi's international division, and Donald had a problem. The board of directors back home hated the idea of participating in this exhibition. They told him, "Donald, the Soviets don't have money. They have potatoes and sadness. Don't go." But Donald went anyway. He bet his entire career on this trip. He told the board, "If I don't get a Pepsi into Khrushchev's hand, I'll fire myself." Bold move, Donald. Stupid but bold. The day of the tour arrives. It is sweltering hot in Moscow, like sweating through your suit hot. Nixon and Khrushchev are walking through the exhibits, and they start arguing. This is the famous kitchen debate. The argument is getting heated. Nixon is sweating profusely. Khrushchev is shouting about the failures of capitalism. The press is snapping photos. Donald Kendall is watching from the Pepsi booth thinking, "Oh God, I'm going to lose my job. They're talking about nuclear war, not soda." But then, Nixon, remembering his friend Donald, and probably needing a break from being yelled at, steers the angry Soviet premier toward the Pepsi booth. This was the moment. The Hail Mary pass of carbonated beverages. Donald Kendall steps up. His hands are shaking, but his eyes are locked on the prize. He offers Khrushchev a cup of Pepsi. Now, there's a myth that the Pepsi was specially brewed for this event, but actually, Kendall offered him 2 cups. One made with American water and one made with Russian water. Because, diplomacy. Khrushchev takes a sip. He pauses. The cameras flash blindly. Then, he smiles. He loved it. He drank the cup. He urged everyone around him to drink it. "This is good Soviet water," he declared, ignoring the American syrup. For Donald Kendall, it was the greatest marketing coup in history. The leader of the communist world, the enemy of capitalism, was chugging his product like a frat boy at a keg stand. Back in the US, the photos went viral, or whatever viral meant in 1959, probably being in the newspaper the next day. Pepsi wasn't just a drink anymore, it was a diplomatic bridge. Donald Kendall saved his job. In fact, he did better than that. 6 years later, he became the CEO of Pepsi Company. But Donald wasn't satisfied with a photo op. He wanted the market. He looked at the Soviet Union and didn't see an evil empire. He saw 250 million thirsty people who had never tasted freedom or sugar water. He wanted to sell Pepsi in the USSR, for real. But there was a tiny, catastrophic economic problem standing in his way. Selling American products in the Soviet Union was effectively illegal and practically impossible. But the biggest hurdle wasn't ideology. It was currency. The Soviet ruble was a closed currency. Unlike the dollar, the pound, or the franc, you couldn't exchange rubles internationally. Their value was artificially set by the Kremlin. Outside of Russia, a suitcase full of rubles was worth less than the suitcase itself. Mr. Kendall, we want your Pepsi. We love the fizz. But we cannot pay you in dollars. We have no dollars. And you cannot take rubles because your banks will laugh at you. Barter, the oldest form of commerce known to man. I give you a goat, you give me 3 bags of grain. But Pepsi didn't want goats. They needed something they could sell in America for hard cash. What did Russia have that Americans wanted? Oil? Too complicated. Furs? Too messy. Caviar? Too niche. Wait. Vodka. Specifically, Stolitnaya. The good stuff. In 1972, after years of negotiation, and Kendall becoming best buddies with Leonid Brezhnev, Khrushchev's successor, a historic deal was struck. It was genius. Every time a Russian drank a Pepsi, PepsiCo effectively got a shot of vodka to sell in New York. It was the perfect cycle of vices. The Russians got the sugar and caffeine, the Americans got the alcohol. Everyone wins. The plan worked beautifully. By the late 70s, Russians were drinking billions of servings of Pepsi a year. They couldn't get enough of it. It was a taste of the West in a bottle. Meanwhile, in the US, Stoli vodka became the premium choice. If you were cool, you drank Stoli. Pepsi was crushing it. They had locked Coca-Cola out of the largest country on earth. The Iron Curtain wasn't iron anymore. It was made of aluminum cans. But as we know, good things in history rarely last, especially when geopolitics decides to crash the party. 1980. The Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. Americans are furious. President Carter announces a boycott of the Moscow Olympics. And suddenly, drinking Russian vodka wasn't cool anymore. It was unpatriotic. Pepsi had a problem. Their money, the vodka, was becoming worthless in the US. But the Russians were drinking more Pepsi than ever. By the late 80s, the initial trade agreement was about to expire. Pepsi needed a new deal. A bigger deal. They were looking at a contract worth $3 billion. The Soviets didn't have $3 billion. They still didn't have a convertible currency. And now, they couldn't even trade enough vodka to cover the bill because Americans wouldn't buy it. So, the Soviet officials sat down with Pepsi and said, "Look, we're broke. The economy is collapsing. But, we do have a lot of stuff left over from the war machine. How would you like a navy?" So, here we are. 1989. The Soviet economy is in the toilet. The ruble is worth less than the paper it's printed on. And PepsiCo wants to renew their contract. The Soviets can't pay in cash. They can't pay enough in vodka. So they look in their backyard and say, "Hey, we have a lot of extra boats." The offer was staggering. To cover the cost of the Pepsi syrup flowing into the USSR, the Soviet government transferred ownership of a naval flotilla to a soft drink company. Here is the official inventory of the Pepsi Navy. Item 1, a cruiser. Big gunboat. Item 2, a frigate. Faster gunboat. Item 3, a destroyer. Submarine hunter. And item 4, 17, diesel. Attack? Submarines? Let's put that in perspective. 17 submarines. At that moment in 1989, PepsiCo possessed more attack submarines than the navies of India, South Africa, and Brazil. If Pepsi had decided to go rogue and conquer a small island nation, they probably could have pulled it off. Of course, military experts will point out, well, actually, these were obsolete. Whisper-class submarines, and they weren't fully fueled or crewed. Shut up, nerds. On paper, in terms of sheer hull count, the military analysis site Jane's Fighting Ships noted that this acquisition briefly made Pepsi the 6th largest naval power in the world, right behind the United States, the Soviet Union, China, the UK, and France. Pepsi was a superpower. Now, you might be wondering, how did the United States government feel about a soda corporation acquiring a private fleet of warships from their mortal enemy? Short answer, they were concerned. National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft called Donald Kendall. He was not happy. The optics were weird. Was Pepsi starting a private military company? Were they going to torpedo Coca-Cola shipments in the Atlantic? But Kendall was a smooth operator. He famously told Scowcroft, and he was right, those were 17 submarines that were no longer under Soviet command. They were now assets of a Delaware-based corporation. But what does a soda company do with a navy? Do they patrol the high seas looking for thirsty sailors? Do they launch missiles filled with carbonation? No. They did what any good capitalist would do. They sold them for scrap metal, The ships were towed to a shipyard in Norway and cut up into razor blades. The Pepsi Navy only existed for a few days on the open ocean before being recycled. But the deal didn't stop there. This was just the appetizer. The submarines were just a way to clear the books for the previous deal. Donald Kendall and the Soviets were cooking up something much bigger. The deal of the century. In 1990, Pepsi signed the largest commercial agreement in history between a Western company and the USSR. Value, $3 billion. That's billion with a B. Since the Navy idea worked so well, they doubled down. The Soviets promised to build 10 brand new oil tankers and huge freighters for Pepsi in their Ukrainian shipyards. Pepsi would lease these ships out to international haulers, make millions in dollars, and use that money to expand Pepsi bottling plants across Russia. It was foolproof. Pepsi wasn't just a soda company anymore. They were an industrial shipping magnate. They were dealing in vodka, oil ships, and cola. They were basically a small country. Kendall had won. He had conquered the East. In 1990, Pepsi was projected to have a monopoly on the Russian market for the next decade. Coke was crying in the corner. Everything was perfect. The contracts were signed. The ships were being built. The vodka was flowing. What could possibly go wrong? Well, do you remember what happened in 1991? History has a funny way of ruining business plans. Donald Kendall bet everything on his relationship with the Soviet Union. He bet on the stability of the Kremlin. But the Kremlin was built on sand. December 25, 1991. The Soviet flag comes down for the last time. The Soviet Union dissolves. Poof. Gone. And suddenly, Pepsi's $3 billion deal turned into a bureaucratic nightmare from hell. Why? Because the deal was with the Soviet Union, but the factories were in Belarus. The plastic was in Russia. And the ships? The ships were being built in Ukraine, and those three countries didn't like each other anymore. When the Soviet Union collapsed on Christmas Day 1991, the world celebrated freedom, democracy, the end of the threat of nuclear annihilation. But in the corporate headquarters of PepsiCo in Purchase, New York, nobody was popping champagne. They were hyperventilating. This was the balkanization of soda. Pepsi's $3 billion deal of the century was based on a centralized system. The Kremlin controlled everything. But now, the Soviet Union was 15 different countries. And unfortunately for Pepsi, their supply chain was scattered across all of them. Here is the nightmare. The Pepsi bottling plants? They were mostly in Russia. The mozzarella cheese for PepsiCo's Pizza Hut chain? That came from Lithuania. The plastic bottles? They were made in Belarus. And the ships? The massive oil tankers that were supposed to pay for everything? They were sitting in shipyards in Ukraine. Pepsi was getting squeezed from all sides. The new Russian government wanted their cut. The Ukrainian government wanted their cut. And the international market for old Soviet submarines had crashed because, surprise, everyone was selling off Soviet military gear. Pepsi was scrambling to salvage what they could. While Pepsi was busy trying to act like a diplomat and secure their fleet, their arch nemesis was making a move. For decades, Coca-Cola had been locked out of the Iron Curtain. They were the forbidden fruit. But now, the walls were down. And Coca-Cola came in aggressive. Coke didn't have to worry about selling submarines or bartering vodka. They just brought cash. Lots of cash. They flooded the market with advertising. They put red billboards on every street corner in Moscow. To the newly liberated Russians, Pepsi tasted like the old system. It was the drink of the Brezhnev era. Coke? Coke tasted like America. It tasted like victory. Within a few years, Pepsi's decades-long monopoly was erased. In 1991, Pepsi outsold Coke in Russia 10-1. By 1996, Coke had overtaken them. Pepsi had won the naval battle, but they lost the Cola War. So what actually happened to the famous Pepsi Navy? Did they ever fire a torpedo? Did they ever sink a ship? No. The 17 submarines, the cruiser, the frigate, and the destroyer were towed to a scrapyard in Norway. They were sold for scrap metal, recycled into razor blades, car parts, and maybe even, ironically, soda cans. The oil tankers from the $3 billion deal were eventually built and sold or leased. But the profits were heavily diluted by the chaos of the post-Soviet transition. It wasn't the windfall Kendall had dreamed of. It was a salvage operation. But the story ends with one final bizarre image. In 1997, Mikhail Gorbachev, The last leader of the Soviet Union, the man who ended the Cold War, needed money. His pension wasn't great. The Russian economy had crashed. So he did what any retired world leader would do. He starred in a Pizza Hut commercial. Describing the commercial, in the ad, a family argues about Gorbachev. Because of him, we have economic confusion, shouts the father. Because of him, we have opportunity, shouts the son. Because of him, we have freedom. And then the grandmother settles it. Because of him, we have Pizza Hut. And the whole restaurant raises a slice and yells, "Hail Gorbachev!" Pizza Hut, of course, is owned by Pepsi Company. In the end, Pepsi didn't just buy a navy. They bought the man who commanded it. It was the ultimate victory of consumerism over communism. Donald Kendall passed away in 2020. He remains the only corporate CEO in history to have effectively disarmed a nuclear superpower just to sell sugar water. The Pepsi Navy is gone. The Soviet Union is gone. But the story remains as a testament to the sheer absurdity of the Cold War. A time when lines on a map meant everything, and the only way to cross them was to offer a drink. So the next time you crack open a Pepsi, just remember, you're not just drinking a soda. You're drinking the spiritual successor to a diesel attack submarine. And frankly, it tastes a little bit like metal.